Well, hello friends, this is Tommy Oaks and this is the Story Break. Previously on the Story Break, I've told some stories about my granddaddy. We all call him Daddy Amos. And I did a series of stories on Knoxville Community Media called Daddy Amos's Dogs. If you haven't seen or heard those stories, I hope you'll go into the archives here and look them up, and I hope you enjoy them. Well, I spent a lot of time with my granddaddy when I was a boy, and he was one of the most interesting people I ever knew. I'll tell you one thing that I thought was really interesting about him, and it was this. I never knew him to be afraid of a snake. You know, I'd see a snake coming, I'd run the other way. He'd see one, he's liable to stop and talk to it for a while. Sometimes he'd pick him up and look at him, talk to him, then lay him back down. He always claimed that snakes were some of his best friends, and that he owed an eternal debt of gratitude to snakes. Well, one day I asked him, Daddy Amos, why do you say that? And he gave the explanation, and I'm going to give it to you right now as best as I can remember the way he told me. Now, you need to know that Daddy Amos never was, for most of his life, much of a religious guy. The rest of the family went to church regularly. The rest of the family did a lot of talking to the Lord and tried to serve the Lord, but Daddy Amos was kind of the big holdout for most of his life. And he'd say, now you all leave me alone, I'm okay, and you all are okay, and we'll just leave things the way they are. But that was before the snakes. Now let me tell you what happened with the snakes. One morning, Daddy Amos told me he got up real early to go squirrel hunting. He got up way before sunrise, went up in the mountains, got down underneath a hickory tree, waited for morning to come and the squirrels to come in. And sure enough, they came in, and before long, he got his limit of squirrels. Well, not far from where he was hunting, there was a big old rock formation called the Flat Rock. Thing about this formation is right in the middle of this big flat space, there was another rock, and you could go put your back against that one rock and sit down on that flat surface, and there was a gorgeous view of the mountains out there, and it faced the east, and you could watch the sun come up. Well, that morning, Daddy Amos thought to himself, I'll sit down here, lay my back against this rock, and watch the sun come up before I go home. Well, he sat down there, leaned back, and before you know it, he just dozed off into a deep sleep. He was awakened by a noise. It was a buzzing, rattling sound. When he opened his eyes, he looked, and laying right in front of him were several big old rattlesnakes, just a-rattling their tails. He looked to the left and to the right. There were more of them. He could hear him behind them. He knew that he was surrounded by rattlesnakes. And he thought, what am I going to do? He moved his hand a little bit, and those snakes started rattling a little harder. And he thought, I've got to get off this rock. I've got to get home. But if these snakes take too much attention to me, I'm a dead man. So then Daddy Amos got desperate. Real gently, he moved around on that rock until he was in a kneeling position. And he looked up to heaven and he said, oh Lord, you know I've never been a real religious man, but I've always believed in you. And you know, Lord, I've never followed you, but I've always intended to. And now, Lord, I'm in a mess. I needed you to help me get off of this rock. So please, Lord, do something about these snakes. Well, those snakes just started rattling a little louder when they heard him talk. Well, Daddy Amos got a little more fervent in his prayers. He said, oh, Lord, I promise you, you get me off of here, I'll try to be a godly man. I'll do whatever you want. Lord, I'll become a Methodist. Now, nobody in our family was Methodist, so that was a pretty drastic thing for Daddy Amos to say. But when he said that, them snakes just started rattling a little louder. And they started moving. They started like a parade, just circling Daddy Amos there. He was kneeling at that rock, and those snakes were just going in a circle around him. Well, he got more desperate and said, Lord, I'll do whatever. Lord, I'll forget the Methodist. I'll become a Baptist. And then he went on and said, I'll become a Free Will Baptist. And then he got real desperate, and he said, I'll become a primitive free will man. Lord, whatever you want me to be. And finally, Daddy Amos said, Lord, whatever it is, I'll just follow you if you'll let me get off this rock and get home. Well, the Lord must have figured that Daddy Amos meant it when he said that. Because here's what happened. One of them rattlesnakes reached out and grabbed a hold of the tail of the snake in front of it and started chewing on it. Well, that snake grabbed a hold of the tail of the snake in front of it, started chewing on it. And the next one, and the next one, and the next one, until all them snakes circling around Daddy Amos were chewing on the tails of the snakes in front of them. They kept chewing and swallowing and chewing and swallowing and eating and swallowing until every one of those snakes had eaten up the snake that was in front of it. And there wasn't a snake left on that rock. Daddy Amos went home. He was good to his word. He found a preacher as soon as he got home. He got right with the Lord. And the rest of his life, he kept his promise and tried to live for the Lord. But he always said he owed it to the snakes, and so he was always friendly to them. And that's the end of that.